You're standing in line. Nothing is happening. 10 seconds pass, and your hand is already moving toward your pocket before you've consciously decided anything. You don't even register it as a choice. It feels more like a reflex, like flinching from heat. You call this being bored. But the real answer to what's happening inside you right now is far stranger than that word suggests. Boredom isn't a glitch in your brain. It isn't laziness, and it isn't a modern invention created by too much comfort and not enough hardship. It's older than language, older than fire. It's a signal, built by evolution, running on hardware that was shaped over millions of years in a world that looked nothing like the one you're standing in right now. So what was that signal originally for? And why does it still fire, even when your life is nothing like your ancestors?
To understand boredom, you have to stop thinking of it as an absence. It feels like emptiness. Nothing to do, nothing happening, a kind of mental vacuum. But psychologist John Eastwood, who has spent much of his career at York University studying this exact feeling, describes it differently. Boredom, in his framework, is the discomfort of wanting to be engaged in something meaningful while being unable to find it. It's not a void, it's a craving with nowhere to go. That distinction matters more than it seems. A craving implies a target. Hunger points you toward food. Thirst points you toward water. Boredom, it turns out, points you toward something too, just not something you can always name. Now picture your ancestors 40,000 years ago. Not in a constant life or death sprint from danger, which is the image most people carry around. For long stretches, especially among foraging groups, daily survival didn't take up nearly as much time as you'd expect. Anthropologist Richard Borshay Lee spent years in the 1960s living among the Juhoansi, a hunter-gatherer people of the Kalahari Desert, and what he documented surprised almost everyone. Getting enough food to survive took up a relatively modest portion of the week. The rest of the time wasn't filled with frantic labor. It was filled with something else entirely. Idle hours. Long, open stretches with nothing demanding to be done. This single observation helped inspire anthropologist Marshall Sahlins to describe hunter-gatherer life as something closer to the original affluent society, not because people had more possessions, but because they had more unscheduled time than almost anyone living in a modern industrial economy. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If your ancestors had all that empty time, why didn't they just lie there, doing nothing? Because doing nothing for very long is dangerous. Not in a dramatic way, not in the sense that a predator is about to appear. The danger is quieter than that. A mind that stops scanning, stops noticing, stops generating new behavior is a mind that stops adapting. And in an unpredictable environment, the ability to adapt is the difference between a lineage that survives and one that doesn't. This is where boredom earns its evolutionary keep. Philosopher Andreas Elpidorou has argued, across several academic papers, that boredom functions as a kind of internal alarm, not an alarm for danger, but an alarm for stagnation. When you're engaged in something that's working, that's teaching you, that's keeping your senses occupied and your skills sharp, you don't feel bored. The feeling only appears when your current activity has stopped delivering anything useful. And the moment it appears, it pushes you to do one thing. Move. Try something else. Look around. So when your ancestors sat through those long, unstructured hours, boredom is exactly what nudged them off the ground. It's what sent someone wandering to a new patch of forest they hadn't explored. It's what had someone picking up a stick and turning it over and over, not because they needed a stick, but because their hands needed a problem. It's what had a small group sitting around a fire long after the food was gone, inventing a story just to keep the moment alive. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Most of what you'd call ancient invention probably didn't come from necessity at all. It came from boredom. Necessity explains why someone needed a way to cut meat. It doesn't explain why someone kept reshaping the same stone tool for hours after it already worked. Necessity explains why people needed shelter. It doesn't explain cave paintings, finger-traced patterns on rock walls tens of thousands of years old, made by people who weren't starving and weren't being chased. They were sitting in the dark with nothing urgent to do, and their restless minds reached for something anyway. Boredom, in other words, might be one of the oldest engines of human creativity, not despite being uncomfortable, because it's uncomfortable. Which brings up an experiment that, on the surface, has nothing to do with ancient humans at all. In 2014, psychologist Timothy Wilson and his colleagues at the University of Virginia ran a study published in the journal Science. They asked people to simply sit alone in a room with their own thoughts for several minutes. No phone, no book, nothing. Many participants rated the experience as unpleasant. Some rated it so unpleasant that, when given the option, they chose to give themselves a mild electric shock rather than sit quietly with nothing to occupy their mind. Think about that for a second. People chose physical discomfort over unstructured mental stillness. Why would a modern brain react that strongly to something your ancestors must have experienced constantly?
Because your ancestors weren't actually sitting still in the way that experiment recreated. Even in their quietest hours, their minds were working, tracking the wind for scent, listening for the particular rustle that meant something was nearby, replaying a hunt, refining a plan, rehearsing a story to tell later. Their stillness was loaded with input. Yours, sitting in a waiting room with no phone, is stripped of almost all of it. You've engineered an environment so sealed off from sensory and social texture that even brief boredom now feels almost unbearable. So you reach for your phone. And here's the twist nobody tells you. That isn't weakness. It's the exact same ancient mechanism firing correctly. Boredom says, this moment isn't engaging you. Go find something that will. Your phone simply answers that call faster and more reliably than anything in the ancestral environment ever could.
The problem isn't that the alarm exists. The problem is that it now has an answer so immediate, so frictionless, that it never has to search for long. And that search was the entire point. The wandering, the stick-turning, the story inventing, the staring into a fire until a new thought wandered into view. That searching state is where new ideas come from. Researchers studying creativity have repeatedly found that mind wandering, the very state boredom pushes you into, is linked to more original thinking, not less. When your brain isn't locked onto a task, it starts making unexpected connections between things that have no obvious reason to be connected. That's not a malfunction. That's the same improvisational machinery that once turned a bored hour at a fireside into a new tool, a new route through unfamiliar terrain, a new way of telling an old story. When you fill every idle second with a screen, you're not eliminating boredom. You're interrupting the search before it finds anything. The alarm goes off, and instead of wandering toward a new idea, you immediately silence it with something pre-made by someone else's wandering mind, not your own. This doesn't mean boredom feels good. It was never supposed to. Discomfort is the entire mechanism. If boredom felt pleasant, you'd have no reason to move, to explore, to invent. The discomfort is the push. Your ancestors didn't enjoy those empty hours either. They just didn't have a way to escape them instantly, so the discomfort had time to do its job.
You do have a way to escape it instantly. Multiple ways, in your pocket, all the time. Which means the oldest creative engine in the human mind rarely gets the chance to run anymore. Not because you've evolved past it, because you've built a world efficient enough to never let it finish a single cycle. So the next time you feel that restless itch in a quiet moment, before your hand moves automatically toward your pocket, it might be worth pausing for just a few seconds longer. Not because boredom is comfortable. It isn't, and it was never meant to be. But because that exact discomfort
is the same ancient signal that once sent a half-distracted mind wandering toward an idea worth keeping. You're standing in line again. Nothing is happening. And for the first time, you let it stay that way.